Photo from 1920. A young couple seems happy until they notice the mark on his neck. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Detroit Historical Museum's conservation lab, illuminating specks of dust that danced in the air. Dr. Emma Richardson carefully lifted another photograph from the estate donation box. This one, protected by a deteriorating envelope marked 1920, private, was slid out with practiced care. A wedding portrait. The couple stood close together in what appeared to be a modest photography studio, a painted floral backdrop behind them. The young man was black, perhaps 25, wearing a new but inexpensive suit. Beside him stood a white woman of similar age, her dress simple yet elegant, her hand resting lightly in his. What struck Emma immediately was how rare this image was. In 1920, interracial marriage was illegal in more than 30 states. Those who defied the law risked everything, sometimes fleeing to northern states where marriage might be legal, but far from socially accepted. Their expressions were serious, almost defiant. No posed joy, no exaggerated smiles. Instead, determination and something darker, something fearful, flickered beneath the surface. Emma placed the photograph under her high-resolution scanner. After 15 years restoring historical images, she had developed an instinct for photographs with secrets. This one trembled with them. As the machine hummed, she zoomed into the digital file section by section. The woman's dress bore careful, homemade stitches. The man's suit was pressed flawlessly, his tie perfectly knotted. They had dressed with care, knowing this might be the only formal photograph they would ever have. She studied their faces. The woman's jaw was firm, her gaze challenging the camera. The man's expression was harder to read, pride wrapped in exhaustion, the look of someone who had survived much already. Emma zoomed to his neck, just above the crisp white collar, and froze. There, barely visible, was a scar burned in the shape of the letter P, with a line through it. The raised, discolored tissue was unmistakable. A brand. Emma's heart quickened. She had seen marks like this only in photographs from before the Civil War. Brands burned into enslaved bodies to mark them as property. But this photograph was from 1920, 55 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The scar was old, but not ancient, likely inflicted when he was a child, sometime between 1900 and 1910, decades after slavery had supposedly ended. On the back of the envelope, written in fading pencil, Thomas and Margaret, married Detroit, June 1920. Do not show family. Do not show. Emma opened her database and began searching. Interracial marriage, Detroit 1920. Illegal labor practices. Convict leasing. Peonage. What she uncovered was worse than she expected. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. Loophole ruthlessly exploited. Across the South, black men and boys were arrested for vagrancy, loitering, unemployment, or no reason at all, then leased to mines, plantations, lumber camps. Conditions were often deadlier than slavery. Companies had no financial reason to keep them alive. If one died, another was leased. Then Emma found something even darker: debt peonage. In isolated rural areas, families were trapped by inherited debt. Children were branded with symbols of ownership, so they couldn't escape or seek work elsewhere. A 1903 investigative report chilled her. In the turpentine camps of northern Florida, I saw children as young as 5 working alongside their parents. Many bore branded marks, letters or symbols identifying which company owned their family's debt. Emma zoomed again onto Thomas's neck. The P was not random. It was a company mark. She called Dr. Marcus Webb, an expert in industrial labor history. He studied the image silently, then pulled up documents. He had seen the symbol before. It belonged to Piedmont Lumber Company, active in southern Georgia and northern Florida from 1898 to 1912, notorious for peonage and convict labor. Despite raids and investigations, victims were too terrified to testify. The company burned down in 1912, killing dozens of locked-in workers. Marcus showed Emma a photograph from a 1908 investigation. Children with brand marks visible on their necks and arms. "They branded them," Emma whispered. "Like property," Marcus replied, "because to those companies they were." Emma needed to know who Thomas was, how he escaped, how he reached Detroit, how he stood proudly in a wedding portrait with a woman who loved him despite everything. The envelope had provided one clue: names and location. After hours of searching, she found their marriage license. Thomas Freeman, 25, born Georgia, factory worker, former residence Florida. Margaret O'Brien, 23, born Michigan, married June 15, 1920. Census records placed them 2 months later in Paradise Valley, Detroit, a neighborhood built by black migrants escaping the violence and bondage of the South. Thomas Freeman, once branded into forced labor as a child, had reached the North, free enough to love, free enough to marry, yet still carrying the scar of ownership burned into his flesh, visible only if you looked closely. The photograph captured not just a wedding, it captured survival. Photo from 1920. A young couple seems happy until they noticed the mark on his neck. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Detroit Historical Museum's conservation lab, illuminating specks of dust that danced in the air. Dr. Emma Richardson carefully lifted another photograph from the estate donation box. This one, protected by a deteriorating envelope marked 1920, private, was slid free with practiced care. It was a wedding portrait. The couple stood close together in what appeared to be a modest photography studio, a painted backdrop of soft flowers behind them. The young man was black, perhaps 25 years old, wearing a suit that looked new but inexpensive. Beside him stood a white woman of similar age, her dress simple but elegant, her hand resting lightly in his. What struck Emma immediately was the rarity of this moment in time. In 1920, interracial marriage was illegal in over 30 states. Those who defied the law risked everything, sometimes fleeing to northern states where such unions were technically legal, but still dangerous and socially condemned. The couple's expressions were solemn, almost defiant. There was no staged smile, no playful joy, only determination, steel-hard and silent, as though they knew a camera could preserve their love, but not protect them from the world outside. Emma positioned the photograph beneath her high-resolution scanner. Over her 15-year career restoring historical images, she had developed an instinct for pictures that held secrets. This one practically vibrated with them. As the machine hummed, Emma examined the digital scan, zooming in slowly. The woman's dress showed careful stitching, likely handmade. The man's suit had been pressed with deliberate precision. Their clothing suggested intention. They dressed for this photo as if it might be the only proof their marriage ever existed. She moved to their faces. The woman's jaw was set with quiet strength, her gaze direct and unflinching. The man's expression was harder to read. Pride woven with exhaustion, perhaps the weight of something survived. When Emma zoomed in near the collar of his shirt, her breath caught. Just visible above the crisp white fabric was a scar. Raised, discolored, deliberately made, shaped into the letter P with a line struck through it. A brand. She recognized that kind of mark. Brands like this appeared in photographs from the antebellum South, burned into the skin of enslaved people as proof of ownership. But this portrait was from 1920, 55 years after the 13th Amendment. The scar was old, but not ancient, likely made in childhood, sometime between 1905 and 1910, nearly half a century after slavery was supposed to have ended. On the back of the envelope, she found a faded inscription, Thomas and Margaret. Married, Detroit. June 1920. Do not show family. Do not show. Emma searched marriage records. After hours of work she found it. Thomas Freeman, 25, born Georgia. Margaret O'Brien, 23, born Michigan. Married June 15, 1920. Wayne County. Thomas listed his previous residence as Florida. Georgia, birth. Florida residence, Detroit marriage. The path itself told a story. A migration north, away from something. But Thomas Freeman did not appear in the 1910 census. Not in Georgia, not in Florida. That absence meant either another name had been used, or he had not been counted at all. People held in illegal labor camps often weren't. Many weren't supposed to be found. Emma broadened her search to newspapers. Articles emerged, reports of raids, rumors of forced labor, peonage, convict leasing, debt imprisonment. A Florida Bureau of Labor report from 1911 stopped her cold. Among the workers was a boy of approximately 16 who gave his name as Thomas. The boy bore a brand on his neck indicating company ownership, brought to the camp at age 7 after his mother was arrested for vagrancy in Valdosta, Georgia. She died in 1906. He remained to pay her debt. He stated, "They said if I run, they'll find me and hang me." Thomas disappeared from records soon after, unseen again until Detroit 1920, standing beside his new wife in a photograph no family was allowed to see. Emma turned to Margaret's side of the story. Census records revealed Margaret Rose O'Brien, born 1897 in Detroit to Irish immigrant parents. Her father died by 1910, leaving her mother a widow working to support 3 children. By 1920, Margaret was a secretary, living as a boarder in Detroit, months away from marrying Thomas. Employment records revealed they worked at the same factory. The owner, a Quaker, NAACP supporter, hired black workers at equal pay, something rare enough to draw both admiration and hostility. He even wrote letters about Thomas to the Urban League, detailing the brand, the labor camp, the escape. The reply was blunt. Legal justice was unlikely. Too many camps had closed. Too many victims were afraid to speak. Too many courts were hostile. The advice was heartbreakingly simple. Let him build his life in Detroit. Don't look back. Emma met with Dr. Jennifer Washington, an expert on the Great Migration. She explained how escapees rarely traveled directly north, instead moving through cities in stages, working where they could, trusting no one, sometimes changing names to survive. Oral histories supported the pattern, boys digging through floorboards, running through woods at night, hiding for days, surviving only through the kindness of strangers and the hope of a life beyond the trees. Thomas escaped, survived, built a life, or tried to, and Margaret chose him anyway. 2 people in a single photograph, both young, both vulnerable, both defying a world that tried to own or forbid them. A scar on a man's neck, a hand holding his gently, and a note begging the future not to forget. Dr. Washington explained, most of them never spoke publicly about what they'd survived. The trauma was too deep, and there was also real danger. Even in the North, Southern authorities sometimes tried to reclaim escaped peonage workers, claiming they were fugitives from justice or debt criminals. She pulled up a newspaper article from the Chicago Defender, the major black newspaper of the era, dated 1916, warning to migrants. Southern agents are operating in Chicago, Detroit, and other northern cities, attempting to lure colored workers back south with false promises of high wages. These agents are working on behalf of plantation owners and labor camps, seeking to reclaim workers who fled peonage conditions. Do not trust offers that seem too good to be true. Do not provide information about your previous residence in the South. If approached by suspicious individuals, report immediately to the Urban League or local police. Emma felt the weight of what Thomas must have lived with. The constant fear of being found, recaptured, sent back to the hell he'd escaped. She returned to the photograph with new understanding. Thomas stood straight, his expression neutral but guarded, wearing a suit that likely represented months of saved wages. Margaret stood beside him, her hand touching his, her face showing determination that bordered on defiance. This wasn't just a wedding portrait, it was an act of resistance. In 1920, Michigan was one of the few northern states that didn't explicitly prohibit interracial marriage, but acceptance was far from guaranteed. Emma found newspaper records describing harassment toward interracial couples in Detroit during that time. One Detroit News article from August 1920 reported that a black man and white woman living on Hastings Street had received anonymous threats ordering them to leave the neighborhood. Police said they could do nothing without knowing who sent the letters. The woman's family had disowned her. Emma couldn't confirm the couple named was Thomas and Margaret, but the timing and location matched. Census records provided more clues. Margaret's mother, Catherine O'Brien, appeared in the 1920 Detroit census, living with her younger children. In 1930, she still lived with them, but Margaret was gone. The breach between mother and daughter, it seemed, never healed. Searching birth records, Emma found 2 children born to Thomas and Margaret, James Freeman, born March 1921, and Catherine Freeman, born November 1923. Both birth certificates identified the children as colored, classified under the one-drop rule that defined anyone with African ancestry as black. The 1930 census showed the family still in Detroit. Thomas, 35, worked at an automobile factory. Margaret, 33, kept house. James was 9, and Catherine 6. They had remained together, raising their children in a city that did not fully accept them. Emma searched further. Thomas Freeman died in 1954, age 59, of heart disease. His obituary in the Michigan Chronicle, Detroit's black newspaper, was brief. Thomas Freeman, longtime employee of Ford Motor Company and resident of Detroit for 35 years, passed away Monday. He is survived by his wife Margaret, son James, daughter Catherine, and 4 grandchildren. Services will be held at Bethel AME Church. Margaret lived until 1968, age 71. Her obituary listed her children and grandchildren, but not her Irish family. The divide created when she married Thomas remained unhealed. More records revealed that James Freeman died in 1989 and Catherine Freeman, later Catherine Williams, in 2003. Both lived long lives, both had children, and both were part of Detroit's black community. Thomas and Margaret's act of defiance had created a legacy that endured. Determined to find living descendants, Emma traced public records and located David Freeman, age 67, grandson of Thomas and Margaret, living in suburban Detroit. She sent an email explaining her research. His response came quickly. "Dear Dr. Richardson, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask about my grandparents' story. Yes, I would very much like to meet with you. They met at his home in Southfield, a warm house filled with family photographs. David, a retired teacher, tall and dignified, carried his grandfather's serious eyes and his grandmother's firm jaw. He led Emma to his study, where a box of family photographs, letters, and documents waited. My father, James, didn't speak much about my grandfather's past," David began, "but my grandmother told me stories before she died. She wanted us to know the truth." He showed Emma a photograph she had never seen. Thomas, older now, perhaps in the 1940s, sitting in a garden surrounded by children. His collar was open, and the brand scar on his neck was clearly visible. Grandma Margaret said she first noticed he always wore high collars, even in summer, David said. One hot day he loosened it, and she saw the mark. He told her he'd been branded like an animal as a child, so he couldn't run. Hundreds of children were held like him, trapped, forgotten. When Margaret asked why he never reported it, he told her, "Who would believe a black man's word against property records?" Emma's eyes burned with tears. David showed her another artifact, a letter Margaret wrote to her mother in July 1920, a month after the wedding, returned unopened and kept for a lifetime. In it, she defended Thomas, condemned racism, and vowed she would never apologize for loving a good man. She kept it, David said softly, because she needed to remember she'd been brave once, even when it cost everything. David shared more of Margaret's memories. Late in life, Thomas wrote his testimony in longhand. "My name is Thomas Freeman, but that is not the name I was born with. I was born Thomas Washington in Valdosta, Georgia in 1895. My mother was Sarah Washington. We were free people, but free did not mean safe. When I was 7, my mother was arrested for vagrancy. She washed clothes for white families, but the sheriff said she lacked proper employment papers. She was sentenced to 6 months' labor and leased to the Piedmont Lumber Company. They allowed me to come because I was too young to be left alone. When we arrived, I understood. We had been sold back into slavery. The camp was deep in the woods. Guards patrolled day and night. Freedom was a word, nothing more. At night, they locked us in wooden barracks. During the day, we worked in the turpentine forests and lumber mills. Children worked alongside adults. If you didn't meet your quota, you were beaten. When I was 8 years old, the camp foreman branded me. He heated an iron in the fire until it glowed red, then pressed it into my neck, while 2 other men held me down. He said it was so everyone would know I belonged to Piedmont. He said, if I ever ran away, any sheriff in 3 states would see that mark and send me back. My mother died when I was 11. They said it was fever, but I think it was despair. After she died, they told me I'd inherited her debt. I would have to work until it was paid off. The debt never got smaller, only larger. They charged us for food, for the barracks, for the tools we used. You could work your whole life and never pay it off. I stayed in that camp for 11 more years. I saw boys die of heat stroke, of infections, of beatings. I saw men hanged for trying to escape. I survived by becoming invisible, by never complaining, by doing exactly what I was told. In 1913, when I was 18, a fire broke out in one of the mills. In the confusion, I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away. I ran for 3 days through swamps and forests, terrified they would catch me and hang me like they'd done to others. I made it to Jacksonville, where a black minister took me in. He gave me new clothes, burned the ones I'd been wearing, and told me to never go back to Georgia or Florida. He said there were places up north where a man could work and be free. He helped me get on a train to Atlanta, then Birmingham, then Memphis, then Chicago, then finally Detroit. I changed my last name from Washington to Freeman. It felt like claiming something that had been stolen from me. I met Margaret at the factory in 1919. She was the first white person who ever looked at me like I was fully human. When I told her about the camp, about the brand, she cried and she got angry. She wanted to go to the police, to the newspapers, to make someone pay for what had been done to me and the others. But I told her there was no justice for people like me. The camps were gone or had changed names. The men who ran them were respected businessmen. Who would believe a black man with a slave brand on his neck over white men with money and connections? So instead, we got married. It was the only kind of justice I could have. Building a life, having children, being free to love who I wanted. Every day I wake up next to Margaret is a day I win. Every day I watch my children grow up safe is a day I beat the men who tried to steal my life. I'm writing this because someone needs to know what happened in those camps. Thousands of us were trapped there. Men, women, children. Most didn't escape. Most died without anyone knowing their names or stories. If you're reading this, please remember them. Remember that slavery didn't end in 1865. It just changed its name. Emma read the document 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This was the testimony that needed to be heard, the truth buried for over a century. She spent the next 4 months preparing an exhibition for the Detroit Historical Museum titled Marked: Slavery After Emancipation. Thomas and Margaret's story formed the centerpiece, but she discovered dozens of similar cases. She worked with Dr. Washington and other historians to document convict leasing, peonage, and debt slavery that trapped hundreds of thousands of black Americans between 1865 and 1945. She gathered photographs of labor camps, legal documents, testimonies from survivors and descendants. The exhibition opened in February 2025. The gallery was filled with community members, historians, descendants, journalists. David Freeman stood before the enlarged photograph of his grandparents, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. The photograph, once hidden with the note, "Do not show family," was now visible to the world. The exhibition led visitors through myth and truth. First, the comforting belief that slavery ended in 1865, then the brutal reality, the loopholes, the re-enslavement, the brands, the forgotten children. Thomas's testimony was displayed beside the magnified image of his branded neck, but the final section showed life, not just trauma. Thomas at Ford Motor Company, Margaret marching in the 1960s, their children and grandchildren thriving, a legacy born from defiance. Dr. Washington spoke at the opening. Slavery didn't end. It evolved. It found new names, new laws, and new chains. Thomas Freeman was one of hundreds of thousands of children who lived through neo-slavery, branded, hunted, and forgotten. Yet he built a life, loved freely, and created generations who stand here today. His existence is resistance. 3 months later, Emma received word from the Department of Justice. The exhibition had sparked a federal review into neo-slavery practices. Though prosecution was impossible, the government was preparing formal acknowledgement and exploring compensation for descendants. Florida historians were planning to excavate former campsites, searching for unmarked graves. David testified before Congress with the testimony and wedding photograph laid carefully before them. He spoke of his grandfather's shame, not shame for the brand itself, but for a world that allowed it. He asked for truth, recognition, remembrance. Emma continued her work, now with major grant funding. She created a digital archive, marked Evidence of Slavery After Emancipation, which grew every day with new photographs and family submissions. One arrived from Atlanta, a young man named Samuel, branded at 14 for loitering, escaped during a transfer, and lived quietly for 60 years. His great-granddaughter asked that his name be remembered, and so it was. Emma stood before the original photograph of Thomas and Margaret, once hidden, now illuminated. Visitors no longer saw just a wedding portrait. They saw evidence, testimony, truth. The brand meant to claim ownership became a witness instead, unerasable proof that freedom is fragile, powerful, and worth protecting through every generation.